Welcome, Room 6 friends, and thank you for joining me today for our Thinking About Math Thursday. For today's math review, we are going to be talking about the third of the 3 essential learning topics that you need to know by 4th grade. So these are the 3 essential learning topics that you need to know by 4th grade. The first is addition and subtraction. The second is multiplication and division. And the third, the one that we'll be covering today, is fractions. So by the end of 3rd grade, you should be able to identify unit fractions, read and write fractions on a number line, and also be able to compare fractions using greater than, less than, or equal to. For today's review, we will cover all of these expectations together. Let's first start with a basic fraction review. So a fraction has a numerator and a denominator, and they both play an important role in reading and writing fractions. The bottom part of the fraction is the denominator, and that tells how many equal parts there are in the whole. And the numerator, which is the top part of the fraction, communicates how many pieces of that whole that the fraction is referring to. So for example, if we were looking at a fraction strip, this is a visual model of fractions, and we saw that it was broken up into 3 equal parts, and 2 of those equal parts were shaded, then we would know that the numerator is 2, and the denominator is 3. So we would write that fraction as 2/3. All right, now what about this example? In this fraction strip, we see that it is broken up into 5 equal parts, and 3 of those equal parts are shaded. So that means we would write this fraction as 3/5. All right, let's use these visual models to talk now about unit fractions. All fractions are made up of unit fractions. A unit fraction represents one part of all the equal parts of the whole. And that means the numerator in a unit fraction is always 1. So what is the unit fraction for this fraction strip? 2/3 is the fraction. But what is the unit fraction? If we were to focus on just one part of the whole, then we would say 1/3 is the unit fraction. Now in this fraction strip, you'll see that there are 3 1/3 parts that make up the whole. We know then that the unit fraction is 1/3. What about for 3/5? What is the unit fraction for this fraction strip? What is one part of that whole? 1/5. We see that there are 5 1/5 in this fraction strip that make up one whole. So now that we understand the basics of fractions, let's move on to reading and writing fractions on a number line. So here is our number line. I'm actually going to break it up into 3 wholes. I'm actually going to break up this number line into 3 wholes. So now we see our number line goes from 0 to 1 to 2 and finally to 3. These are whole numbers. We need to find fractions inside of those whole numbers. Let's start with our 2/3 fraction strip here. That means we're going to break up each whole into 3 equal parts. So let's start at the beginning of our number line. We know that 0 is the same as 0/3 because our number line here is broken up into thirds. What comes next after 0/3 is our unit fraction, 1/3. After 1/3 comes 2/3. Here on the number line is 2/3. Now what if we wanted to find the fraction 5/3? Well, we know that 5/3 is an improper fraction. Well, we know that 5/3 is an improper fraction. That means that it is more than one whole. So let's continue labeling our number line up to 1 whole and then see how much further we need to go to find 5/3. We've done 2/3 here. Next comes 1 whole or 3/3. After 3/3 comes 4/3. Our denominator does not change. Our numerator is changing because now we're finding different points on the number line, but that does not change our denominator. Our denominator will constantly be in thirds all the way down the number line because that's our unit fraction. That's what we've broken up the whole into. All right, after 4/3 comes 5/3. There's our 5/3. All right, let's do one more number line practice. Now this number line is going to represent this fraction strip we did here to show 3/5. What is our unit fraction? That's right, the unit fraction represents 1 part of the whole. 1 part is 1/5. So let's break apart this number line into fifths. Now that our number line is broken up into fifths for each whole, let's start labeling them. We know that 0 represents 0/5. Next comes 1/5. Remember, this is just like normal counting. It moves from 0/5 to 1/5 to 2/5 to 3/5, which is what we're looking for. So now we found 3/5 on this number line. What if I gave you another fraction to find? What if I gave you another improper fraction to find? Let's search for 12/5. So we left off at 3/5. Let's continue to mark our number line until we get all the way up to 12/5. So next I have 4/5 and then 5/5, which is the same as 1 whole. We're still not at 12/5, so let's keep going. So as I continued to label on my number line the fractions, I had 6/5, 7/5, 8/5, 9/5. And what does 2 wholes represent? 10/5. Tricky way of figuring that out is we know 2 wholes times 5 equal parts in each whole equals 10/5. But we're still not there. We're trying to get to 12/5. So if we left off at 10/5, then next would be 11/5 and then 12/5. And now we labeled 12/5 on our number line with this circle. All right, so now that we've reviewed the basics of fraction, reading numerators and denominators, identifying their unit fractions, reading and writing fractions on a number line, let's finish our review today by talking about comparing fractions, finding which is greater, which is less than, or perhaps if they are equivalent, are they equal to one another? So we're going to talk about 4 different ways that you can compare fractions. Let's start with if they have the same numerator. So if we were to compare 2 fractions, for example, let's go back to our unit fractions. We were comparing thirds and fifths. So let's compare 1/3 and 1/5. Now, if the numerator is the same, then your focus can be on the denominators. We're focusing on now thirds and fifths. Are thirds greater than fifths? Are they less than fifths? Or are they equal to? Let's use a model to take a look. So here I show one fraction strip broken up into thirds, and then right underneath it, I show a fraction strip that is broken up into fifths. If we were to compare those, just focusing on one part of the thirds and one part of the fifths, we can see that thirds are greater than fifths. Remember how we talked about how it's a little opposite when we talk about fractions. Now, the smaller the denominator, the larger the fraction, because there's less pieces that have to be broken up for that whole. Whereas with fifths, now we have more pieces and they have to squeeze into that space. And so they don't end up being larger than thirds. They end up being smaller than thirds. So we would say 1/3 is greater than 1/5. Now, what if they have the same denominator? For this problem, let's stick with fifths. So what if now we were comparing 2/5 and 4/5? These are probably the easiest fractions to compare because now we're talking about the same type of thing. Here we're talking about 2 elephants versus 4 elephants, or 2 cookies versus 4 cookies. The 5/5 are the same, so they're much easier to compare. Now we can say 2 is less than 4. 2 elephants is less than 4 elephants. 2/5 is less than 4/5. Now, what if you have 2 fractions that you need to compare, but neither the numerator nor the denominator are the same? Let's take a look at an example. Let's stick with the thirds and the fifths like we've been using. So earlier in this video, we were focusing on 2/3 and we were focusing on 3/5. 2 and 3 are not the same, so they do not have the same numerator. 3 and 5 are also not the same, so they do not have the same denominator, which means we can't use these strategies to compare. Great way to compare fractions when you have 2 fractions that don't have anything in common is to use a visual model. So let's draw 2 fraction strips and compare that way. All right, so here are my fraction strips that I'm going to use to compare these 2 fractions. I showed 3 equal parts to represent my 2/3 and colored in 2. Then for my 3/5, I showed 5 equal parts and then I colored in 3. So let's take a look to see which is the greater fraction. So using these lines, I can see that although not by much, 2/3 is greater than 3/5. And finally, you have been asked to find equivalent fractions. What is a great trick that you can use to calculate an equivalent fraction or to check and see if 2 fractions are equivalent? It's simple. We use multiplication and division in order to find equivalent fractions. Let's start with 2/3. So we've been asked to find an equivalent fraction to the fraction 2/3. Now, we can use multiplication in order to find a numerator and a denominator that would make a fraction that would equal and would be the same size as 2/3. Let's start with the denominator. Here we have thirds. We can multiply thirds by 2. We can double 2/3 and find an equivalent fraction. We can triple 2/3 and find an equivalent fraction. We could quadruple 2/3 and find an equivalent fraction. How about for today, we start with doubles. 3 times 2 equals 6. Thirds can be equivalent to sixths as long as we also multiply the numerator by 2. Now for the numerator, 2 times 2 equals 4. So we can say that 2/3 equals 4/6. What about that other fraction we were working on? 3/5. Let's find an equivalent fraction to 3/5. How about for this one, we challenge ourselves a little bit. Let's take the denominator and let's triple it this time and find an equivalent fraction to 3/5. So we would say 5 times 3 equals 15. Good job. 3 times 3 equals 9. 3/5 is equivalent or equal to 9/15. All right, so now we've had a chance to review some basic fraction information like numerators and denominators and unit fractions. We've also been able to read and write fractions on a number line. And finally, we use these 4 different techniques and strategies to help us compare fractions, to find which is greater, which is less than, or how they can be equivalent, how they can be equal to one another. In the comment section, I'd like you to share any questions that you still have about fractions. Okay, and I will see you tomorrow for our fun Friday. I hope you have a wonderful Thursday. Bye, or high five.